Dr. Jennifer Bird. I'm a biblical scholar, and I care very much about what people do with what they find in the Bible. I've been doing a bit of a series on some of the sayings or parables or things attributed to Jesus that I think make more sense when we read through a political and economic lens. And this is one of those videos. So the story I want to read and talk about with you is a story about a vineyard, a man who has a vineyard and he leases it to tenants, and the story goes from there. And I want to discuss up front the way I heard this and the way I taught it for many years. I heard this story as an analogy an analogy referring to God and how God interacts with the people, the chosen people, the Jews, and then according to my faith and the scripture and the traditions I was a part of, Christianity, then also how God is interacting with Christians now. And so I heard this story as being about the man in the story is God, and the vineyard in the story is the covenant, and the tenants, initial tenants are the Jews, and the second round of tenants later are the Christians, and the people that he sends to collect for himself would be the prophets, and then his own son that he sends is actually Jesus. And those are the basics that I worked with, and most of my students who did grow up in a church heard this story interpreted that way as well. So I hope that is enough of this is the fairly traditional way of handling it. It's a spiritualized way. I think it actually makes more sense if we read it kind of a little bit more literally and read it through the lens of this is an event, this is a thing that took place. This is the way the poor people were being treated and misunderstood and forced into situations where they would end up acting out in violently, and not to justify violence by any means, but that we're misunderstanding the story if we're not seeing this story as a representation of what the general people were dealing with. Okay, so this is in Luke. It also shows up in Matthew chapter 20. This is Luke chapter 20, starting in verse 9. Jesus began to tell the people this parable. A man planted a vineyard and leased it to tenants and went to another country for a long time. When the season came, he sent a slave to the tenants in order that they might give him his share of the produce of the vineyard. But the tenants beat him and sent him away empty-handed. Next, he sent another slave, and that one they also beat and insulted, which is probably a reference to raping, and sent him away empty-handed. And he sent still a third, and this one they also wounded and threw out. Then the owner of the vineyard said, "What shall I do? I will send my beloved son. Perhaps they will respect him." But when the tenants saw him, they discussed it among themselves and said, "This is the heir. Let us kill him so that the inheritance may be ours." So they threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. What then will the owner of the vineyard do to them? He will come and destroy those tenants and give the vineyard to others. When they heard this, they said, No, heaven forbid. But he looked at them and said, "What then does this text mean? The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. Everyone who falls on that stone will be broken to pieces, and it will crush anyone on whom it falls." When the scribes and the chief priests realized that he had told this parable against them, they wanted to lay hands on him at that very hour, but they feared the people. Okay, if you read this story the way I was taught to read it, and the way I taught others to read it initially, then you're actually saying that God established a covenant with the Jews, and when they didn't seem grateful, or they didn't give God what God asked of them, God decided to get rid of them and start the covenant with Christians. And in fact, the story says God will destroy the first tenants. God will destroy the Jews and find new tenants. So now God will start up the covenant with Christians. it's an awful way to interpret it. And there are people who do read it that way, and because of coming from all the different elements of the supersessionism of Christianity over Judaism, some people don't even pause to hear how the ramifications of those claims. It's one story out of many, but it's one story that justifies killing Jews and justifies it by suggesting they're disobedient or disrespectful or something. But if we read it a little bit more literally, Jesus is talking about a man planting a vineyard. How does a man come by land? Well, lots of ways, purchasing it. But also, as last week's video tried to point out, sometimes you had to give up the lease to your land or the deed to your land because you couldn't pay the taxes in the temple. And so what land that you would have been working for subsistence and for regular crops and to try to survive, you have to give up the deed, and so someone else is owning the land you used to work. And now, well, what tenants is that landowner going to hire to work the land? But perhaps, and in fact, I'm not making this up, this is a thing that happened, the very people who used to own it are now being hired to work the land they couldn't make enough money off of. And now it's been turned into a luxury crop, all kinds of issues there. But they're also now supposed to work the land, survive, pay a tax, and pay a tribute. So they couldn't do it before with a regular subsistence crop, and now they're like, it's a worse situation than it was before. And so, not that I am okay with violence or murder or any of the things, but if you read it through this lens, they have been placed in an impossible situation, so that when the landowner sends someone to collect for him, he's absolutely clueless of the oppression and the situation they're in. And so no, they're not going to give him what he deserves, because this is an awful situation to be in. And that explains why they would say to each other, this is the heir. Let's kill him so we can have the land back. It isn't the way it worked, but that's what you can see happening in this story. We need the land back. And so what is he going to do? He's going to destroy these tenants, do whatever he can to get rid of them, and hire some more poor saps who are desperate to survive. It's a very different reading of it, and it is more true to the story, I think, in terms of what Jesus would have been talking about, in addition to it challenges the idea that we should be reading a story told by Jesus as being vehemently anti-Judaic. I'm laughing. It's not funny, actually. But I know that there are people today who still read it this way and still suggest that we interpret it in that very anti-Judaic way. So, wow, how nice when we can read it through political and economic lenses and see Jesus is angry about the exploitation of the people, and it is focused in the temple. See you next time.